So are there any questions for Craig?
Yep.
Ray, the very thing I was going to ask, why did you leave the dragon?
There was okay, let's just go back to that slide, shall we?
Given he killed Beowulf, that's kind of, the part of the story that's quite important.
Well, one, there was a practical consideration, and up there it does say problems of representation, problems of narrative, and problems of performance. So I guess on the representative side, Heaney flags this up as kind of dragons being a mildly overdetermined form of beast in literature and film. So it's very hard to do the dragon kind of originally, and again we will have such a set idea of what a dragon is that it provides representational problems of how do we get around this. That was one aspect of it. Secondly, the poem itself is split in two. It's about a young man going off seeking his fame and his name, and then we have 50 years go by, and then Beowulf is a king in Geatland, and then he meets the dragon, and it always seemed to me it had to finish the tragic cycle, and it had to finish it with death. But he had to defeat Grendel, and he had to defeat Grendel's mother for narrative, thematic purposes. And so, and because of the sort of, I say, the temporal difference between those two, it becomes also quite. There were two separate things. There were almost two separate stories in a way there. And so I decided to split them because also of the practical considerations of the show had to be around an hour long, and so if there was going to be anything that went. Again, I am a fan of the dragon, but I realised that there are some problems, and also I think shifting in the way that I want to. I really wanted it to be about art and art making, or at least my adaptation, and be strongly focused on that. And the ones that really deal with Beowulf's psychology more so, I think, are Grendel and Grendel's mother. And the dragon represents this absolutely unstoppable force, and Beowulf is the nearly immovable object. And so it reaches its tragic consequence there. But it was thematically not quite what I was looking for. So it was a mixture of those three things, rather than any hostility to Mr. Dragon or Mrs. Dragon. I don't know if it's gendered.
So would you rule out Beowulf too? I've read Tolkien on the dragon, and Tolkien's very very fond of it. But again, it strikes me as, and I think Heaney, or I agree with Heaney here, that it is a really overdetermined object, that it just goes around, breathes fire, has flappy wings, and we see kind of renditions of it so constantly that it perhaps can be, to a certain extent, hampered. And sometimes you have to do something so consciously different that then you're really not serving a story, or you then just do something so unconsciously bland. It seems to draw between those two poles, and so maybe I'm a coward, but I chose not to deal with that. Okay. Yeah. Oh.
Why did you choose to use Heaney as your base translation of the old version?
Well, one, because I'm familiar with Heaney and Alexander's translation, but for other translations I've read, Heaney seems to pick up hold to the natural stricter meter of the essential verse in a way that, because you also have prose translations. I think Alexander's is a prose translation actually, and so it kept to the actual poetic meter there. Also, I'm a massive fan of Heaney. I think he's got a brilliant vocabulary, and I think he just he works. I don't read Saxon, although I'm very mildly familiar with it. I'm much better with Middle English. But I've read sections from it, and I'm sort of familiar with how it paces and how it moves. And I think Heaney's was the closest to that. So I think for those philological reasons, and also that it was interesting because it was Book of the Week recently after he died. There was Beowulf Book of the Week, and I listened to all of those, and that absolutely convinced me of the kind of masterly, but maybe it's a performance of Heaney. So yeah, I think it was more philological and an appreciation of Heaney as a poet as well.
My question is actually related to yours. It's, if you take Heaney's translation of the original text, which I can read in Old English, the lines are pretty close, and they match each other really quite tightly. To what extent does yours then match? I mean, if you've fiddled with the rhyming and so on, then obviously it's not going to be line for line.
No, not at all.
Paragraph.
No, actually, it was much more. It was a far more heterogeneous sort of adaptation. In that, for example, I give Grendel and Grendel's mother a voice. They don't have a voice in the original poem. They don't speak. We're told by the omniscient narrator that they feel like this. That they're doing this and so forth, but they don't actually speak. And I always thought, so I wanted to make them speak. So that required a different approach. But also, I really have reshaped it for a dramatic production in that I've not really paid. I've paid attention to certain lexical choices, such as word hoard and those lovely rich compound phrases, which so beautifully evoke the cultural context and such lovely it sound actually quite original words like bone house for body. I love the idea of the bone house being this concept of the body. But I did actually generally eschew I kept the rough dramatic structure, but I really did eschew the poetic structure, because I realised that if I wasn't going to have voice characters and I wanted to represent them as distinctive, then I had to be using a different. I Frenchified it. I made it into a French operetta, I suppose. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm interested in the use of puppets, because I think it's got a really interesting choice. I wonder what kind of what was behind that decision and what kind of challenges it posed to you, because I mean, one of the problems of puppets like animation is it's got the assumption of being for children, and being was there a problem that you might make this epic poem seem quite lovable by having little figures?
Well, it certainly does allow. I think, I mean, when I, for example, watch a cartoon, one thing you note about cartoons, sometimes it seems extremely detailed, but actually it's a specifying simplification. So you have the contours of a cartoon character, or you see that's a very detailed paving stone on like a Murakami kind of animation, and it's actually less detailed than the paving stone actually is. But it's just that Murakami animators are picking out something quite specific, and so I think with these forms you can pick out something quite specific. So it's very easy to be comic, I think, with puppets. But also, when you're watching puppets, you are aware of your suspension of disbelief in a way that you're not aware of your suspension of disbelief when maybe you watch a naturalistic actor, or at least you have that kind of experience which Brecht was so against, of actually just being involved, as it were. And so there's a certain distancing effect where you're always kind of critically aware, and I think that was thematically purposeful, because I wanted it to be about art and art making, and also so people, when they come into the theatre, they see a Saxon poet walks on and says, we are all in a hall, and the harp plucks a note, and the guttering fire raises lambent flames. So he's setting you up to be in a mead hall, and so but it's all about you are being shown something, and I think puppets are especially good for that. But another thing is it's very difficult to do a convincing dragon puppet as well. That was a technical feat that was perhaps one technical feet too much.
Probably easier than another medium, a puppet dragon.
But no. So there was that as well. Yeah.
It reminds me of something I read years ago, actually, that the very first production of Wagner's Siegfried, when they did it in Bayreuth, they ordered the dragon costume from a theatrical costumier in Bond Street in London, and of course there were all the sort of difficulties of at that time of trying to send this thing all that distance, and also the language barrier that they had to get over. What actually happened was that the head of the dragon arrived in Bayreuth absolutely fine. The body of the dragon arrived absolutely fine. The neck never arrived. And for the first performance, you had this stunty little round shoulder. Siegfried apparently got booed for killing you. The rumour was that the neck ended up in Beowulf.
Well, so they provide a hell of a lot of difficulties. That's a great anecdote.
There was a version of stage version of Goblin Market. I don't know if you saw it.
No, I didn't.
A combination of puppets and live actors, and it had someone sitting on the stage, similar to as you described, as you just reading the poem, I wondered if that had been an inspiration.
No. Actually, that's interesting to hear about, actually. But we with the poet, there was a kind of to sort of set up the different dramatic frames. He actually did all the poet's own words. He memorized. The actor memorized and delivered to the audience. But then when you have dramatic characters, he picks out a book of Beowulf and then reads the dramatic characters and turns to the puppet stage. So there is. So I certainly think the idea of also flagging up as reading is one you have to remember less, so that's good. But two, yes, it does help to sort of flag up that narratorial aspect.
I'm just curious. In the original text, because I'm reading Adaptation, I've been reading a lot, and it says that there's a lot of Christian elements in the text. Did you include any of that in the text?
No, I go. There's a school I think that starts with. Is it? No, it's not. Auden. Who was it that did that brilliant adaptation of The Seafarer? American poet. Anyway, the Saxon poem, The Seafarer, he did a kind of adaptation of it, and it stops just at the point where the seafarer goes into a lot of Christian theology, and it just finishes there. And I think there's a lot of debate and a lot of concern about the Christian elements in Beowulf because they seem flown in to a certain extent, and so I didn't choose to. There were two things I didn't choose to have. One was genealogy, and the other was the Christian element. One because it's a whole other. I mean, the idea of genealogy and going, Hagelac was this person's son and he married this person. I think to modern dramatic sensibilities, that's a killer. But also with the Christian, there's because we have this idea of Grendel being Cain's son, or of the descent line of Cain, and it never seems to me to thematically bite in the drama itself, and it's almost there are certain points in the poem, I'm sure you're aware, where they sort of almost mention, oh, of course that would be pagan to do that, and so people didn't do that, of course, because that would be pagan. It's almost as if we've got this pagan poem, which I think is what was the case, and then we had a Christian gloss. So because there's that tension as well, it was something that I think is less thematically rich in the original, and so it's something that didn't actually interest me to take on, because it seems slightly twisted in. And again, if you look at the Seafarer, the last 25 lines I think just become really sort of bland Christian sermonizing, which seems absolutely and utterly against the thematic grain of the Seafarer, and it's markedly odd, at least to my reading. But so that's why I avoided it.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Craig.
Thanks. Great. Cheers. Thank you. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.